High risk, start sits for week 6. Last week we talked about Darren Waller ascending, Rachaad White filling in for Bucky Irving, Woody Marks, Emari Demercado, Jamar Chase, Derrick Henry. I am giving you risky plays this week that could have massive upside or potentially destroy your fantasy lineup. This week, I am focusing in on players in the flex range because we've got all these injuries piling up. You've got big decisions. And of course, if you have any start sit questions, just go ahead and drop them in the comments. Hassan Haskins and Kimani Vidal are literally the double whammy of high risk starts. Now, 1 week after Emari Demercado burned fantasy managers, we should probably approach this Chargers backfield with a little bit of caution here. Amari Hampton was thriving as the lead back. It does make it an appealing situation, right? He had 2 top 10 performances in weeks 3 and 4 before suffering his injury in week 5. However, we would be remiss to not ignore the fact that this backfield was an ineffective committee in weeks 1 and 2 when neither Amari Hampton nor Najee Harris even reached double-digit fantasy points. The Chargers were very vocal this offseason stating that they wanted to use multiple backs. If this does become a true committee, it might not be fantasy relevant. Now, we are dealing with a week where fantasy managers are reeling with injuries, and this is a very advantageous matchup against the Dolphins. Haskins and Vidal are very similarly ranked low-end flex options. Risky plays, but solid potential if you really need to go there. And when I say similarly ranked, I am not joking here. I literally have them 2 spots apart in my rankings, and in Fantasy Pros ECR rankings, they literally have the same range of rankings, highs and lows, and in overall rankings, they are back to back. I talked about this in the Big Questions video. I do give the slight lean towards Haskins. He has a long history with Harbaugh, and last season Harbaugh did use him inexplicably multiple times at the goal line. He should have the lean in terms of goal line opportunities, and that's what truly matters here because, the Chargers are in a beautiful matchup against the Dolphins that should yield multiple goal line opportunities, bad offensive line or not. Because of the combination of committee speculation, but the good matchup here, they're both still interesting flex plays this week. High risk, but interesting. I follow practice reports very closely because it is important to me and it is important to you guys as well. I make this video on Thursday morning, which means that I don't have the Thursday practice reports, unfortunately, and that is what matters. Now, the Wednesday practice reports for San Francisco both have Ricky Pearsall and Jauan Jennings as DMPs, did not practice. Wednesday practice reports literally do not matter, like at all, truly. It is quite literally a rest day often for veterans, and if you have even just like the tiniest injury, you're probably going to be limited or DNP. Now, that said, it does sound like that Ricky Pearsall is a no-go for this week. Jauan Jennings is still unclear at this time. I have the pleasure of listening to an injury analyst, an actual injury analyst, when I do my weekly recap shows with Fantasy Pros on Sunday after the games, and Ricky Pearsall's injury was a potential multi-week concern here. Jauan Jennings, a little bit less of an issue, but again, we still don't know, so we have to wait on the news for Jennings. But if Pearsall is out, and it sounds like he is going to be, Kendrick Bourne is absolutely on the table again this week. Bourne literally showed out in week 5, 10 receptions for 142 yards. While we are still unclear on Brock Purdy's status as well, if we get Mac Jones, that's actually an advantage there for Kendrick Bourne. That's even better. Bourne was technically the wide receiver 1 for Mac Jones in New England, and this production is not unusual for Bourne. He has shown high upside in the past. Now, it does come with inconsistency. So it is very possible that he gets out there, drops some passes, and we get the week 4 version of him. That was not good. But he is a streaky player and a viable option when he's hot, and he is hot right now for fantasy managers that need upside in terms of their play this week. Kendrick Bourne can get you there. Calvin Ridley finally came through in a big way here. Unfortunately, you might not have had him in your fantasy lineup because he had fallen out of our circle of trust. But now we are faced with the challenge of asking ourselves, do we now trust Calvin Ridley to repeat his week 5 production? That's the big question here. Calvin Ridley literally doubled his total receiving yards from the previous 4 games combined, with season highs in receptions, targets, and yardage. Although we are still waiting for that elusive touchdown to come. Maybe it'll come this week. Big performances, again, do not necessarily mean that you will get repeat production. We got burned on that by several people last week. Woody Marks was one of those guys. Bad offenses can be inconsistent, and Ridley is still a risky start despite the strong performance. Cam Ward ultimately is still very, very early in his development here. There will be inconsistency. He had just 2 touchdowns on the season, and week five's performance of 265 passing yards was his highest total of the season here. And again, we need to remember that up until this last performance here, Calvin Ridley was being outperformed by Alec Iomater. Now it could flip, but it is something that we need to still be cautious of. Ridley remains more so in the flex option. With Ridley, drop any start sit questions because it really is on a case-by-case basis here. After 2 weeks of suffering, led by Jake Browning, T. Higgins finally cracked 10 fantasy points, just barely there, just barely. While the production was definitely welcoming, it was still rather underwhelming. Higgins had just 3 receptions, tied for his highest of any game this season, and he got the touchdown. That was good. This low-volume version of T. Higgins, not a fan. We like our T. Higgins with the range of like 8 to 12 targets as the Bengals chase points with a bad defense. But the Bengals offense has been so bad they can't even really chase points right now. Now we've got a new Bengals quarterback in Joe Flacco. We talked about it. He is expected to start this week. And while Flacco should have no problem stepping into this offense very quickly, he's a very seasoned professional there, we should still be very wary of T. Higgins. The Browns receivers had terrible production with Joe Flacco all season. And statistically, Flacco hasn't been outperforming Jake Browning. We talked about this in the Big Questions video. Ultimately, it should be Chase Brown that gets the boost here in terms of check down opportunities. And the matchup here is very risky. The Packers looked very stout early season, but they were torn apart by Dak Prescott before the Packers bye week. But Dallas's offense could just be prolific. And this version of Cincinnati's offense simply is not prolific. We also already saw Joe Flacco against the Packers. Again, different team, but we saw this. And he had 142 yards and no touchdowns. There is legitimate reason to be scared here. Fantasy managers should continue to view Higgins as a very, very high-risk flex option. Usually I don't talk about players in the Thursday night game in this video because I put it out on Thursday, but it's my channel. I want to talk about Wan'Dale Robinson. I will allow it. Let's talk about Wan'Dale Robinson, who got off to a fantastic start this year. 14 receptions, 8 targets, nearly 200 yards, and a touchdown through the first 2 weeks here. You love to see it. You want the best for him. We have seen a new version of Wan'Dale Robinson. Varied usage, actual deep passes here. Wan'Dale Robinson is a versatile receiver, but he was stuck in the slot catching balls just 5 yards beyond the line of scrimmage, if that. Since the start of his season, unfortunately, his production has dramatically dipped. He has failed to reach double-digit fantasy points. Last week, we expected to see a bump in volume with the Malik Neighbors loss for the season, but Robinson had just 5 receptions for 30 yards. And this week, with Darius Slayton out, now we think, okay, now we should finally see more volume to Wan'Dale Robinson. It is only him and Theo Johnson that you could possibly throw to. And especially in this matchup here, where we've got the Giants probably playing from behind the majority of the game here against the Philadelphia Eagles. Robinson is a high-risk start, but again, he is the wide receiver 1 of this offense. He has varied usage. He has boom potential. This could be a boom game for him if you need a desperation heave there at flex. I want to make a little comparison here between DeVonta Smith and Jameson Williams. I find it very interesting that Jameson Williams and DeVonta Smith are very similarly ranked in terms of their ranges here. They're both wide receiver 2s with extremely high ceilings, inconsistent volume, and this week they are being ranked somewhere between wide receiver 28 and wide receiver 2, depending on the person there. Smith has more than double the receptions of Jameson Williams and has had multiple high volume games without having to rely on one big play to reach his ceiling. Smith is risky, but I think we might be overselling the risk here. Smith's production isn't volatile. It is actually somewhat predictable. Now, you have to look at the actual play-by-play logs to see the pattern here with Smith, but the targets clearly come in bunches. The Eagles increase pass volume when defenses force them to do so. In week 3, Smith had the breakout game when the Eagles were forced to throw, playing from behind at the end of the game. Week 5, strong performance from Smith in a loss to the Denver Broncos. Smith's production requires 2 things. As long as the game is relatively close and the defense is stopping the run very effectively, the Eagles will throw. If it is a great matchup for Saquon Barkley, the receivers then have problems. Therein lies the issue with this week. This is an excellent matchup in a revenge game for Saquon Barkley. Smith could struggle to see volume this week. Now, it is entirely possible that the Giants are incentivized to stop Saquon, especially Brian Dable, right? They want to stop him from embarrassing them. And maybe they sell out to stop the run and force the Eagles to throw. That is what happened with Kansas City. And that is why Smith, that was his third best game. Makes sense, right? But the odds are in favor of a big game for Saquon here, so we should be a little bit cautious with Smith. You might view Romeo Doubs as a risky start because the Packers receivers have not been reliable on a week-to-week basis, and it has been that way for a long time, but I actually see Romeo Doubs as a very safe start this week. Should you fully trust Romeo Doubs rest of season? Absolutely not. However, we are talking specifically about week 6, and Doubs is a safe play with Jaden Reed still out and Christian Watson's debut very unclear right now. Doubs is the wide receiver 1 for the Packers for the time being. I love Matthew Golden. His volume continues to rise on a week-to-week basis, but Doubs remains the most reliable option in that offense outside of Tucker Kraft. In an excellent matchup with Dallas in week 4, Doubs had 3 touchdowns. While that is unlikely to repeat here, this week's matchup against Cincinnati presents another fantastic opportunity for fantasy managers to plug in Doubs as a high upside flex option. Cincinnati's defense is so bad that even Joe Flacco that we just talked about, threw for nearly 300 yards on them. Coming off the bye week, this is a real get-right game here for the Packers. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. You can find me across all social media platforms at It's Terra Time. So make sure that you tune in, you subscribe, you turn on notifications because I'm bringing you fantasy football content all season long. Every week, I've got you covered with waiver wire ads, live shows, live Q&A where you can ask me questions, and so much more.